Hello. Welcome to Discord Q&A number 21. Starting out with, can we get an anti-shield option for AP assassins, not mages? And they were specifically asking for advantage against shields, not shield reduction. So I do want to note I have an anti-shielding and anti-healing question down here, so I'm not going to talk too much about that topic here. I kind of have to touch upon it. I'll have to touch upon it a little bit here, but I'm not going to go super in depth in detail. That'll be covered later on and down the line. But anyway, uh, ultimately, there's a couple things I want to establish before I even get into talking about this space. Number one is that shields should be good against assassins, right? If you think about what a shield is from a mechanics perspective, a shield is temporary health that goes away. Maybe it decays and it actually goes away, over time, right? It essentially dots itself, but it is an amount of health that you add to someone that is fundamentally temporary. In most cases, obviously, there are permanent examples like with Malphite passive, but that's not what we're talking about here, right? We're talking about the typical shield, which is temporary. And the assassin class, what they're trying to do is they're trying to say, in a relatively narrow window of time, I want to deal your entire health bar's worth of damage, right? And so anything that says I give that person more temporary health, of course, should be good against the assassins, right? Like that goes kind of fundamentally goes counter to their game plan. The larger their health bar is temporarily during that time window when they're trying, when the assassin is going in and trying to kill them, naturally that means that it is going to be harder to accomplish that game plan for the assassin, right? Because assassins typically don't overkill people until they're ahead or reasonably far into the game, and so temporary health can help prevent the assassin from getting ahead, right? This is exactly what like how barrier works. How many times if you've played AD carry are you thinking, oh yeah, the assassin came and I like barely lived because of my barrier, or in the olden days because of my heal or whatever, right? Bursts of HP, especially temporary bursts of HP, are very helpful against assassins, very useful against assassins, right? And so, one thing I do want to establish is that I think for some reason, not saying there's this person in particular, but I've talked with a lot of people that, and some people seem to be under the impression that shields shouldn't be good against assassins, which is bizarre because mechanically speaking, they're like one of the most effective things that you could do to counter their game plan directly, which is, yeah, I want to deal your entire health bar. Okay, what if I made the health bar larger in the moment when you went in? Okay, that of course that's supposed to be good against them. Now, just because something should be good against a class, like from a mechanical perspective, doesn't necessarily mean that we can't have access to some systemic mitigation for that factor, right? As an example, fighters get access to Merc treads, right? Where, hey, you know what? When Jax is trying to play the game and he's just getting, hit by Lissandra W and Lissandra R, that's a really tough experience for Jax. But when he gets Merc treads, it's a lot more you can have a lot more functionality against someone who has a lot of CC or a team that has a lot of CC, and that can be really good, right? Like I think that's actually really good that we have that softening of the counter in the game. Similarly, AD carries for most of the maybe not most of the game, but for a large percentage of the game should actually be countered by people that have a lot of armor. But eventually they can get LDR or Mortal Reminder, which helps soften the counter of armor. Partially the reason why that's good is that AD carries are also supposed to end the game, right? And so them being able to overcome their counterplay to a certain degree is a really good way of helping the game trend towards a natural conclusion that relies upon the players and not upon the minions. This is a sort of a side tangent that I want to note here, but some of the reasons why a lot of the things that the way that they are in the game, uh, even if that, it might seem like, well, this is weird that it's like this. It's not like these other systems. So that the game is ended by player actions, because one of the easiest ways we could get the game to end is just make minions scale really heavily. And we've tested versions of this internally. But that ends up being a really unsatisfying way for the game to end, is just like, oh yeah, the minions just kind of like blew up our towers and then like killed our nexus or something because three of us died, or, we were caught at Baron or something like that and we couldn't recall in time. When the minions are really powerful and they're just like taking towers on their own, it's a really, really unsatisfying way for the game to end. And so a lot of the way the game is shaped is so that the game ends as a result of direct player action. And like the game progresses because of direct player action. Anyway, irrelevant tangent aside. Well, I guess it's not totally irrelevant, but like low relevance tangent aside. Getting back to the actual topic here. Shields should be good against Assassin's baseline. Now, should they have access to some form of ability to mitigate how powerful shields are against them? I don't know, right? This is a question I don't have a super strong answer to. AD assassins currently do. AP assassins currently don't. One thing I'll note here in relation to this, I'm not going to get super in depth on this, but I am a little bit skeptical that we could actually make a item that gives you shield advantage that is good for AP assassins and not mages, right? Maybe there's some really heavy-handed stuff we could do here where it like requires you to be in melee range or something like that, but I'm not even sure that that's that compelling. I'm not even sure that that version of the item is functional for the assassins. But generally speaking, our AP system does not have the level of differentiation that the AD system has. And there's upsides and downsides to that. I'm not here to debate that. But the reality is that AP assassins and mages share almost all of their items except for the mage exclusive items, which are the mana items, right? AP assassins don't need mana. We tune them away from needing mana, generally speaking. In fact, I think we should probably tune Fizz to need mana less. He's still, I think, maybe a little bit too mana hungry, but that's not important. Anyway, point I'm getting at here is that we have a way to make an item more tailored in this first slot towards mages, which is by putting mana on it and costing it appropriately. But we don't have the reverse currently of a really like clearly proven out way to make an item exclusively accessible to AP assassins. Partially because flat penetration is really good on mages as well as assassins, right? Unlike in the AD system where there's other external stats like crit and attack speed that scale auto attack DPS that AD carries really care about, but there's no equivalent in the AP system. So there's some tough things there around how would we even differentiate the item? Like, could we even how confident would we be we could actually get something like that? I'm not sure. Then I think we get into kind of wrapping back to the topic that I abandoned randomly in the middle of talking about it to talk about the mage versus assassin thing. Going back to, should AP assassins have access to an advantage against shields? I think to me, the question here is some of the question is about degrees, right? I think to me personally, the degree to which Serpent's Fang counters shielding is too extreme. 50% is a lot, and it breaks down a lot of the gameplay that shields are supposed to have in the game. And another thing to note, again, I'm not going to get super in depth on this, but it's like shielding does not need the same types of counterplay that healing does, because shielding is innately temporary. It has its own built-in counterplay. Healing does not, right? Healing is permanent. You just get to keep it forever. And so shielding probably shouldn't be subject to the same level of counter, just from a numerical perspective as healing, even if we have that available in the game. Something I'll note about something that scares me about shield advantage comparatively to shield reduction, though, like one thing that shield reduction does solve that shield advantage actually doesn't, is that imagine a scenario where you're playing Fizz and you have the shield advantage item, like you deal increased damage to shields, and you're fighting an AD carry, say it's Kaisa, who has barrier, and you have an ally nearby. You have, I don't know, your Jin or something like that is nearby. By one player having a powerful shield advantage item, we're actually introducing new sequencing concerns, both for playing against, playing with, and playing as, because of an item, which is really scary. What I mean by this is that the Kaisa has a lot of incentive to barrier specifically your Jin's damage, right? She now has to actually consider not just, am I about to be burst? Is burst about to hit me before pressing barrier, but where is the burst coming from? And is it more will it be more efficient for me to barrier later on in the fight when Jin auto attacks me versus barriering the Fizz QW or E or whatever, because the Fizz deals significantly increased damage to shields, which could be scary. Sorry about that. But then you also have to consider the Jin. It's imagine a world where the Kaisa barriers and the Jin is about to fire an auto attack. In the Jin's case, do they say, actually, I should wait for my Fizz to hit this barrier and I should just wait for the Fizz to blow it up or for it to expire before I auto attack? How should I play this? And similarly, as the Fizz, if the Kaisa has barrier, are you supposed to hold one of your spells for when the barrier comes out? Or, the Janna shield or, whatever. It doesn't have to be specifically barrier, right? But any shield necessarily, right? And I think that's scary because we typically try to avoid items that create very, very strict sequencing concerns. And obviously, of course, I'm sure a lot of people are thinking, well, that's only going to be relevant if the anti-shielding properties are very powerful, or the shield advantage is extremely powerful. Something to note here is that I do think that a lot of this stuff, like a lot of the things I'm talking about, do kind of go away. A lot of the concerns go away if the shield advantage properties are relatively on the smaller side, which is why I would be more accepting of an item in that space, or more inclined to think an item like that, could actually be functional. But the problem is that the amount of advantage you need against shields in order to feel like it's functional is actually pretty large, right? The original Shadow Flame is a good example of this. The original Shadow Flame had a very mild anti-shielding property on it, where you would always get the full benefit of the flat magic penetration if the target was shielded. Or I think if they were shielded recently, right? I think that was also part of it. I don't remember the exact details. But ultimately, the uh, the mild versions of this don't feel like they're actually doing much. We've tested a number of them over the years, and the mild anti-shielding properties or mild shield advantage properties tend to not feel like they're actually giving you anything that you actually care about. And then they sort of sit around as like riders on an item that are secondary to the purpose of the item, which could maybe be okay, right? Like maybe that's actually how we're supposed to do this, is we're supposed to make a couple of items that have shield advantage riders that are not the main focus of the item, and maybe that's actually good to let some of these assassins have some mild or mild advantages against heavy shielding, but the item itself is supposed to do something else. I don't know. That seems like it's a reasonable path to go down. But when the shield advantage properties get to be sufficiently large, we have these concerns that we add a lot of sequencing difficulties and sequencing headaches to the game in ways that probably aren't appropriate for an item. There's just a lot going on there, and a lot of things that I'm kind of skeptical are good to have in the item system. And so I guess my summary of my response to this is I don't think it's impossible, but number one, shield should be good against assassins, and you're going to have to accept that if you really like playing assassins, regardless of whether you're AD or AP. Shield should be good against you. That's sort of like counter to your primary game plan, in the same way that CC is good against the primary game plan of fighters, or burst is good against the primary game plan of AD carries or whatever, right? Like etc. Doesn't necessarily mean you could never have anything to wear away at that counter, but they should be good at a baseline. Number two, I'm not confident in our ability to make an item that is tailored exclusively only at AP assassins and never is purchased by a mage. There will probably be, at a bare minimum, some crossover with burst mages, even if we shape the item very heavily towards burst, because burst mages have a lot of properties in common with assassins, and their items tend to look pretty similar as well. They tend to share a lot of that same space. And I'm pretty skeptical that we would want a powerful shield advantage item in the game at all, due to some of the gameplay that it breaks down and some of the sequencing concerns it would add. So that's kind of my summary, but none of that is to say that this is like an impossible thing to have or an impossible thing that we could never make. I just think the way that I look at it is, I don't know. I'm a little skeptical that we'd want to make something in this space, but it's not an impossibility. Systemically delaying when boots can be purchased, tier 1 or tier 2 boots. And this person went into a lot of detail talking about a specific complaint they have around they're playing melee versus range top. The range top laner bases and gets early boots 1 or boots 2, and they have a really big movement advantage because the range top laner will get more gold, and then the melee top laner won't be able to afford the same tier of boots, or won't be able to afford the same tier of boots with combat stats that the range top laner has, and they lose out advantages. One thing I'll say very quickly here is, like, one specific type of matchup in one specific role is not something that we're going to systemically lock everyone out of an important systemic function for, right? The reality is boots are a system that is important to all the roles. And so I think it should be pretty clear that we're not going to prevent people from buying early tier 1 boots or tier 2 boots if that's something that they want to do, because that's generally an option that is positive for the game, that supports AD carries, junglers, mid laners all have that option, and so we're not going to do that, right? Like that I think is not something we would do exclusively for a microcosm of specific types of matchups in one lane. However, the reason why I included this question in the document is that I think there is something to talk about here, right? Which is ranged, like there is a problem statement here, which I think is a totally valid complaint to have, which is, hey, I like to play melee top laners, and ranged top laners harass me in the early game, and they get a CS advantage. Maybe they even kill me sometimes. And then they come back to lane, and I'm being told the counterplay is like I need to hit level 6, or I need to wait around for my jungler to gank and have enough HP that we can kill them, or some combination of these things, right? Because most of the ranged top laners do get outscaled in the 1v1 by most of the melees. It's not universally true, of course, right? But that is the case a lot of the time. And so there are advantages that the melee eventually does have. But the complaint that the ranged top laners get such a large lead and then it becomes too difficult to actually execute on the windows of opportunity that you might have later on in the laning phase to make it to mount a comeback. I think that's a fair complaint to have, right? This is something I've talked about previously around maybe the tools that melee top laners have aren't sufficiently powerful, right? There's two ways I kind of look at this, like as viable potential like solution spaces, right? One of them is, well, if melee champions just don't get harassed as effectively by the ranged top laners and they can just farm more, right? This would be like Doran's shield and second wind are more powerful, right? Are the two levers that we've typically used in the past for this purpose. In that case, then we can make those things more effective, or we could just increase the health regen that typical melee top laners have. That's also a viable solution. We haven't actually done that on a global, like on a large scale before, but we've done it on an individual case by case basis a couple of times of like pulling a melee top laner's health regen up or down, especially base regen up or down, in order to make them stronger or weaker, specifically against range matchups, because health regen is just better against the ranged champions, generally speaking, because you're more likely to get harassed and less likely to get all in. Obviously, there are exceptions. Again, I'm generalizing a lot here because that's useful for getting through this conversation. Well, I guess not really a conversation, is it? Where I'm just kind of talking, getting through this yapping session, as they say. Anyway, getting back to the actual point I was on is one I think sort of avenue of attack if we wanted to address or like assuming that we came to believe, which I don't have a super strong opinion on this in the current game. I'm inclined to believe that it is probably true that maybe the advantage range top laners are getting in the early game is a little bit too much right now. But if we decided that that was something we wanted to address or something we wanted to mitigate, the I think immediate obvious solution is, well, we could just let melee top laners have more early gold by giving them more, sustain so that they're harassed less, so that they get more CS, and so that they have more windows of opportunity to come back against the ranged champions, right? As an example, even an amount of health regen that means that you get 2 more CS before you have to base can make a huge difference, right? That could be easily be, 40 gold if you get 2 melees, right? And so that 40 gold might let you buy an extra longsword or buy boots in addition to a refillable or whatever, right? Even those small amounts of gold can really add up to a lot over the course of a game, right? Like how often as a melee top laner do you find yourself in a situation where you get that level 6 all in off after your first base, but you're just a little bit of damage short, right? I know, speaking from my own perspective, like that's happened to me more than once this year, and I haven't even played that much top this year, right? So ultimately, I think even small differences, like small amounts of additional like ways for the melee top laner to get a little bit more gold, can make a big difference here, and I think can give you more windows of opportunity to actually interact with the ranged champion, regardless of whether they have more movement speed or not than you, right? Like or whether they're able to buy tier 1 or tier 2 boots. And of course, if we made it so that ranged top laners were significantly less effective at denying melee top laners gold, then there's a world where, okay, well, maybe you just try and force base timing such that they can't get a tier 2 boot advantage on you, right? And that maybe that's something that's actually possible in a world where you have a little bit more agency, a little bit more health to trade in the early lane. The other thing that's interesting to talk about, and this is something that I really only thought about when I when I was like in relation to this question, is are tier 2 boots appropriately powerful across all different types of champions? It's a really interesting topic to talk about because boots have flat MS on them, right? They don't have percent MS. And this is a more sort of hypothetical designery space. So, don't necessarily take this as, oh, I'm, thinking seriously about, changing the way that boots work. But it's just, I think it is an interesting sort of thought space to explore is because range champions on average tend to have lower base movement speed, they actually gain more relative benefit from the flat movement speed on boots, right? Because if you think about the value of a stat, right, it tends to be with stats that have linear returns. The more of a stat that you already have, most of the time, the less benefit you get from it. It's not universally true, right? But something like movement speed, for example, plus 30 movement speed is obviously way more useful to someone who has 325 ms than to someone who has 500 ms, right? Like at 500 ms, like even disregarding the soft caps on movement speed that exist in League, which they do exist, uh, even if we said it's like, oh, it's the same relative amount of ms, regardless of the soft caps or not. Of course, going from 325 to 355 is going to be way more meaningful than going from 500 to 530, right? Because the differences in what you can do with that movement speed are much lower, right? And the percentage amount your MS is growing is much larger at the lower amounts of movement speed. And because tier 1 and tier 2 boots are flat MS, that actually kind of suggests like that range champions in general, or just low MS champions, there are some melees at 325, like Nautilus, for example, get more benefit from boots, like buying boots, than high MS champions, like say Master Yi, right, who is 355, which is an interesting topic. And I think it's kind of an interesting thought experiment to have of like, okay, well, what if that wasn't true? What if we just said boots give you movement, like a flat movement speed value, right? Changing them to percent, to be clear, would have a lot of implications on how they interact with other systems, and so that one is like, I'm pretty skeptical of that. But in general, though, if we gave you tiered movement speed on your boots based on what your base movement speed is, right? Like imagine a world where Master Yi gets like 8 more movement speed off of tier 2, regular tier 2 boots than Nautilus, who has 325, or Nivea, who's 325, right? What does that mean for the game? Like, can we actually make the incentives movement speed wise for both champions to be relatively the same? What are the outcomes of this? Are they good? Are they bad? Like, I think for like these kinds of top lane matchups, the outcomes of this actually generally seem like a positive to me, right? Like you'll be at less of a movement speed disadvantage. And if you do manage to get your boots, you'll actually have be able to maintain your movement advantage more so than you can on live when the flat MS comes in for both players. But there's a lot of interesting things that you could think about of like, oh, this probably affects bot lane a lot, right? Like boots become, especially tier 2 boots, become a lot less attractive for AD carries probably, because most AD carries have pretty low base MS, right? There are a bunch of melee champions that are probably excited, much more excited to actually just rush tier 2 boots in this world, right? Like high base MS melees that can then leverage additional MS to take advantage of this. Again, I'm not actually saying we could do this, but it is something that would get it, like sort of mitigate this. And it is an interesting thought process because from a pure mathematical standpoint, it kind of makes sense that our global system of base MS could probably be a little more equitable between different tiers of base MS that we have in the game. Now, of course, solving this would be like hideously complex, and the actual gameplay differences probably wouldn't be that big, right? Like the relative difference in MS values that you're getting are not that large, and so it's like, oh, Master Yi probably doesn't actually get 8 more MS than a 325. He probably is getting like, he's probably supposed to get like 4 more MS or something like that. I haven't actually done the math for the percentages. But the point I'm getting at is like, it's an interesting thought space though. And I could see a world where actually we believe that ranged champions are benefiting a little bit too much from rushing boots, and that melees should benefit more, or like high base MS champions should generally benefit more, and they should have some benefits there. I could see that being a thing that we could conclude, and something that I could see that being an interesting topic, of design space in the future. But yeah, to sort of get back at the original question, though, of course, we're not going to lock out boots behind like legendary item purchases for the entire game just because a ranged top laner might want to buy tier 2 boots and have slightly more movement speed. That is clearly not like, we're not going to break that system down just because it might be frustrating for a melee in this option, right? Because honestly, the actual answer here is like, well, if that's actually out of line, we should just make it so that the melees have an easier time resisting the ranged top laner in the early game and they can get more gold by farming. Is there any space in the top lane champ pool for a melee ability-based AP diver? Short answer to this is I think yes. In general, I think we'd love to have more viable AP carries in top lane. I think we've generally been happy with the outputs when we've put more AP carries in top lane, right? Like think of champions like Gwen, champions like Mordekaiser that we've made that I think have generally had good outcomes, both for solo queue and for pro, and I think that's generally desirable. In general, I'll say like when people ask me questions about is there any space for there to be this like general thing that's like slightly different than what exists there normally? It's like the answer is usually going to be yes, outside of like really specific, like crazy out there pitches. Like, what about an 80 carry that turns into a tank? It's like, maybe if we found the exact right way of doing that, but I'm a little skeptical of that pitch at a baseline. But most of the time, if you're like, oh, what about an AP like diving fighter that's a jungler, or what about an AD mage that goes mid lane? It's like, yeah, I think these things all like there's space for a lot of things. Like League is a really robust game. I think the game can handle a lot of things. It's just it's not really a question of is this thing possible. The question is always, do we find a really compelling reason to do this thing? What's our priority? Like, what do we want to make? And there's a lot of different reasons why we make different types of champions. I don't have too much to speak to there, right? I'm not a champion designer. I'm not an expert on that topic. If you want to hear more about that, then try to find August streaming and talk to him. But in general, though, the game is really, I think, robust and supportive. Like it's capable of supporting a lot, and something straightforward like a melee ability based AP diver in top lane, yeah, sure, why not, right? Like, what's stopping us? In much the same way that like there wasn't really anything stopping us from making an AP juggernaut, and so we made Mordekaiser. There wasn't really anything stopping us from making an AP light fighter, and so we made Gwen. Now, could the itemization support for those champions have been better? 100%. And we've added more itemization support since both those champions came out for the AP fighter class. But ultimately, the possibility was always there. And I think something like this is very clearly in bounds of like what we absolutely could do in League if we decided that that was what we wanted to make. Thoughts on Quinn's state, maxing W, vision spell, full burst range talon build tendency. And this person was also talking about how, like, complaining that she was weak early and weak late, which is actually the opposite of that is true. You can look that up on any stats website. She's actually at her weakest in the mid game. She's actually quite good early, and she's okay late, which you can kind of think through, and it kind of makes sense if you think about her build, where her first item is generally, like, for the past I don't know what, like 4 years or something like that, 5 years, something along those lines. Her build has generally been get whatever first item spikes you the most immediately. If it offers wave clear, even better, right? Currently, this is Profane Hydra. Previously, it was, one of the previous versions of Shiv. And, you just get a really powerful spike. And then after that, you tend to build some mix of lethality and eventually crit. You eventually want to get like an IE and maybe an LDR or something like that. And you sort of act as a bad/mediocre 80 carry, but because of your ultimate, you can be present in pretty much every fight if you're alive. And so, super late game, having a kind of like not that good 80 carry that is in every fight, it turns out that's actually not that bad of an output, especially since you can also cover side waves really easily, which is a useful output, even if it doesn't like feel the most amazing on Quinn. Anyway, we don't need to get into all that power curve stuff. I do think that there are some things that are awkward about Quinn's current state. Quinn is one of the champions that we identified as not being served as well by the role quests as we wanted, right? The top lane role quest in particular that levels you up is something we identified Quinn as one of the outliers, as hey, she is traditionally like a traditional top laner that does not really care that much about being high level, and levels are not particularly exciting on this champion in comparison to like gold. And the reality is, even last season, mid lane was statistically much more powerful than top. And then the role quest made that even more true, which is why we actually, I think we actually, this was in the the first patch hotfix, I think, gave her more level scaling, I believe, and we might have reduced her gold scaling. I don't remember. Maybe we just buffed her. I don't recall the exact details, but I remember advising the designer who was doing the work, like, yeah, we should give her some more level scaling so that she feels good about top. Because at the time, her the gap between top and mid had increased significantly, and so we closed it a little bit by giving her more level scaling. Anyway, we don't need to get into all of that. And so I think a lot of systems changes combined have, I think, changed the way that Quinn views the game. I think Symbiotic Souls, it's kind of interesting because from a factual like data, like just raw power perspective, Quinn didn't really need Symbiotic Souls, right? She wasn't massively nerfed because those didn't exist. But I think from a feel perspective, that one of the things that Symbiotic Souls actually did well was they made Quinn feel special, right? It's like, oh, I get to buy this special boot that not that many other champions can buy, and I get to take massive advantage out of it from it to spam reset and do my special thing, which is flying around the map and looking for kills, looking for isolated targets, looking for people who I can fly up onto and kill instantly. I think that some of our systems changes have made Quinn a little bit less satisfying in some ways, and I think it would be awesome if we could find ways to bring that back, whether it's through systems or whether it's through her kit itself. um, Speaking specifically to the maxing W vision spell thing, it's interesting. This is one that's been debated a lot between designers on a variety of teams internally. This is something that even in the past has been debated a lot. Right, it's just a topic that's really never died out of what is correct for this champion. Where back when she maxed Q, uh, that has a tendency to force her into actually being ranged Talon, right? Where you have variance on one spell, which is your Q. You either land your Q or you don't. And the end result of that is often you fly up to people. If they're full HP, you often can't even kill them. But if they're not full HP, you say, okay, do I hit my Q? Okay, you're dead. Do I not? Okay, I can't kill you anyway because you don't have a lot of DPS. And you have a lot of gameplay hooks on the kit that don't really play into that super well. It's like, okay, your Harrier procs aren't that exciting. Your crit scaling is not that exciting. Your extra marks from your E and your Q aren't really that powerful because you're just auto attacking with a bunch of lethality, and you don't have that much attack speed. It's hard to actually get all of those autos off. You don't have a lot of DPS until you get to like level 13, and I think there's a lot of undesirable consequences there around, hey, the way that this manifests is Quinn has great wave clear at level 9, and she just tries to one-shot people, and she really, truly is just ranged Talon. Whereas the W max at least gives her a really different game plan, a really different pattern around sustained damage, and it makes a lot of the questions around whether, when you want to, press R and fly onto someone a little different around. The question becomes, like, how am I approaching them? Right? Not can I hit Q on this person or can I instantly kill them with my Q burst combo? It's about, okay, can I approach this person in a way that I can get the auto attacks off that I need? And there was also always a section of Quinn players that really wanted her to play more into the attacker fantasy rather than the burst fantasy, which is part of why Quinn got moved to W Max in the first place, right? Now, I do 100% agree that there is something very awkward about maxing a button that is effectively a passive, right? No one's excited to press Quinn W as a vision spell and say, like, oh yeah, that's the spell I'm maxing first. I love getting lots of vision, right? It's like, who cares, right? The attack speed is obviously the part that carries the power, and there is satisfaction in that, right? I do want to be clear. It's like, I do think there are clear upsides to having a lot of attack speed on Quinn and just like generally being excited to proc your Harrier marks. That is advantageous for the champion. But the part where you press W is also very awkward, and I empathize with that. I don't have a great solution, right? It's like one of the things that I've thought about before. I don't necessarily know if this is good. I haven't really like super deeply thought this out, like the end consequences here. But one of the things I've kind of thought about before is, what if we moved the passive from the W to the Q, and we made the Q rank up worse, right? Like it doesn't deal as much damage in AoE, but you have this like level 9 spiking champion where you probably max E second, actually, right? In this world, maxing W is probably pretty bad. But in this world, it's like a QEW champion where the attack speed is something that you sort of get for free while maxing your Q, and it's the Q is softened a little bit because we would, obviously, of course, have to nerf the max rank output in this world, and in this world, you kind of get a softened version of everything, right? You get something that's more of a hybrid of the older, full lethality versions of Quinn and the modern, attacker crit Quinn builds. Um, could that be interesting for Quinn? Maybe, right? Like again, I haven't really thought that through, but maybe that's something where we could get the satisfaction that we want. But I'm not sure where we pull the power, right? Like aside from just nerfing the max rank output of Q, we'd probably have to pull power elsewhere. Would you be able to get exactly as much AS as you get right now from the W? Probably not, right? Like where, do we want to give her more AS per level because of that? Do we want to, put some, like where do we want to just like make her a little bit less good at harassing around level 9, right? Does this mean she needs to have less AD per level? I'm not really sure what the end all outcomes of this would actually be. But what I'll say is that I do think that she has she's in an unfortunate position where she was already in a state where mid was pretty clearly more powerful than top lane, which was not the way most of her players want to play her. And uh, then we made some systems changes that exacerbated that pretty heavily. So we made some systems changes to sort of bring that back a little. And it's still the case that mid is significantly more powerful than top. And we have, I think, degraded the way that Quinn interacts with systems in some ways. Not intentionally, of course, just like it's an incidental, some champions are like anytime we change a system, it's basically going to be worse for some outlier champion almost every single time. So that's the reality of just making changes in a game with 170 plus champs. You can't account for every single outlier champion in every single change that you make. And I do think that she is a champion that could maybe benefit from some change. Something that's been talked about before, for example, is like, hey, is Quinn's shape like the time when she starts roaming? Is that right? Right? Is she powerful when she roams in the right ways? Right? Like, should part of her roaming power be that she's really really good at actually just like catching a lot of waves because she's just factually really fast? Should she have more ability to roam from her lane to other lanes, right? Like one of the things we do to restrict this is that her ult has a very high mana cost at the first rank, and so because of that, you kind of have to base a lot if you want to actually use your ultimate much. And that's something that's been discussed as like, is that right in the current day? I don't know, right? Like there's a lot of questions to ask here. I don't have the answers. I haven't spent a lot of time working on this, right? Like as as an example, it's like the live pod did some of their follow-up work on Quinn earlier this year. I have not been working on the live pod, so I'm sort of out of the loop there, and so I can't give you a super amazing like this is exactly the exact detail of exactly what we should be doing or the exact direction that we should be moving in. But I do acknowledge that I think our systemic changes have done Quinn some disservices, and it would be nice if we could find some ways to mitigate or maybe resolve some of the things that have sort of incidentally damaged Quinn over time in regards to our systems. Your thoughts as a system designer as it relates to WASD and ranked, specifically talking about the influence on my day-to-day work. The answer to this question is pretty simple. The answer is that it doesn't really affect my day-to-day work much at all. But I still thought this was interesting to talk about the topic because I think WASD and ranked is a pretty interesting topic, and WASD as a control scheme is a really interesting topic in the way that it sort of interacts with the game. Because I think a lot of people internally, when we first started talking about WASD, made a lot of assumptions around like, oh, this will have a really, really, really big impact on how people play this class of champions, this or this other subclass, or this particular champion, and exactly will benefit a lot from this, or really be bad with this, or whatever, right? Some combination of those things. And I think what we found over time as we tested and refined the exact mechanics of how WASD works in League, what we kind of came to the conclusion of was actually with the right mechanics, like with the right mechanical setup and with the right version of WASD, it ultimately ends up not affecting the actual outputs that a player has it only ends up affecting the inputs, right? A lot of input mechanisms, right? When you think about like keyboard versus controller for some games, it ends up that both your inputs are different and your outputs will also be different, right? Because some things are just going to be a lot easier on one versus the other, right? Like keyboard versus controller in FPS games, right? Of course, classically, aiming on a controller is significantly more difficult. And so traditionally, the designers of those games give aim assist to the controller users such that they can have aim levels that are, like aim output that is similar to the keyboard and mouse version of the game, right? And that's because they want there to be some equivalency there. But the reality is that WASD, interestingly enough, the difference in output between WASD and click to move is much lower overall than I think most control scheme differences that games offer these days. And so, at least the way that we have WASD arranged exactly, right? Like there was, of course, a version of WASD that we could have made, right? That something that mapped more identically to what Wild Rift has, for example, which is imagine a world where you can hold a movement direction in WASD and you just kite perfectly on all no matter the conditions, right? What we actually did was we said, okay, the skill test should be similar to click to move, and we ask you to uh, unpress and press the movement keys at the correct time, kind of similar to click to move, where you have to input your movement command at the right time to cancel the animation of your auto attack. And so it ends up being much more similar. But we could have made other versions of WASD that were more differentiated in output with the same inputs, right? But ultimately, we decided to make something more similar in output to click to move, which then therefore translates into, hey, ultimately, you think about the things that a system designer works on a typical day, like items. Well, doesn't really matter, right? I work on Endless Hunger. I don't care whether you're on WASD or click to move. Endless Hunger is the same item. Or like, I don't know, minions, where it's like, okay, well, you're last hitting in exactly the same way. If I make them tankier or I make them squishier or I make them do more damage to each other or I make them faster, none of that's really affected by WASD versus click to move. If I change towers, oh, I move this tower 100 units. Okay, maybe WASD might matter here, right? Like I think the map terrain is the closest area as a systems designer, like or in terms of systems design that actually does have some interactions here. But ultimately, WASD is not that far from click to move, right? You have 8 directions of movement. I'm not actually sure how many directions of movement you effectively have when you're on click to move. I'm sure it's a lot, but I'm not sure how the server actually calculates pathfinding well enough to understand that like that number. But ultimately, 8 directions of movement is good enough to approximate a lot of the things that click to move does with reasonable accuracy, and so therefore the end all, like the end state there ends up being okay. We don't really need to consider the difference between WASD and click to move because the differences in your movement are relatively small, and so uh, that isn't really something that comes up on a day-to-day basis for systems design. Now, what I will say for champion design, I think it's a little more relevant around, hey, champion designers, if you want to hear their their perspective, this is another case where it's like, well, try to go find August streaming and get his thoughts on it. But I do think that there are some things that are more friendly to WASD or more friendly to click to move that you can make in terms of champion inputs and outputs that probably do intersect some there that the champion designers would probably need to think of. But again, I'm not an expert in that area, and so I would recommend if you want to hear more about that, go try and find August and get his thoughts on that. Could Smolder get mid lane focus buffs with Fearless becoming a more prevalent pro play format? This is something where I love Fearless, but I don't think that it actually resolves any of the issues with Smolder mid. Let me kind of quickly cover some of the issues that Smolder mid caused and like just Smolder solo lane in general, because I actually think Smolder top had all exactly the same problems, except they were exacerbated in some ways. Um, Smolder, when he was more stack scaling and less item scaling, had this problem where, in order to moderate his incredible like late game scaling power, we had to take power from somewhere. And one of the only places we could take power was the early game, right? This made his bot lane 2v2 kind of non-functional, right? Like the fact that he couldn't actually outtrade other AD carries like auto for auto. And even when he was, getting an auto Q auto trade, it was still hard for him to outtrade most of the things that other AD carries were doing. But turns out that just having the basic attack and building AD and, having a caster spell was good enough for him to actually function, with the kit that he has in the solo lanes. And so because he could get stacks faster there and his early game was less reprehensible in the solo lanes, of course he was better there. And this led into one of the problems we've had with many champions where, hey, we want to support the champion's main audience in the role that they were either designed for or that they, mainly go in. Kale has had the same problem in the past as an example with Kale mid where, oh, we want to buff Kale top, it's not that good, it's weak or whatever. But actually, Kale mid restricted us from doing that, right? We found some pretty effective levers for most of these champions, right? Kale being a good example of, we found some levers that are pretty effective to make Kale mid a lot worse relative to Kale top. And Kale mid is still totally viable. You can absolutely still play it if you're a Kale mid player. It's just not limiting us and preventing us from buffing Kale top when it's weak. Whereas the version of Smolder that we had before with the immense powerful stack scaling, before we changed it over to him being much more item scaling, that version of Smolder was actually gated by his power in solo lanes where we could not buff him bot because of how powerful he was in the other roles. And that caused some significant problems. I think another significant problem we ran into with Smolder mid and just generally AD carries mid during the time period when Smolder mid was really powerful was that during that sort of moment in time, that meta, that set of systems that were in the game, AD carries mid were just the way to play the game, right? Because the AD carries mid against melees would bully them very hard early, and they had the sustain such that the assassins had a really, really, really difficult time actually killing them. They had too hard of a time harassing them to a point where they could actually get the kill execution off. And then against the mages, the AD carry sustain was powerful enough that the mages would run out of mana early on, trying to shove the wave and couldn't actually trade effectively with them. Like they would just, be able to win some trades, but wouldn't actually be able to get the kill onto the AD carry. And then the AD carry with the, resourceless auto attack would just eventually win the lane through attrition. And then, of course, the AD carries would also outscale those champions as well, right? And so that was sort of a difficult situation where, of course, it's not that reasonable if you have a champion who doesn't have a super sharp weakness that's winning lane and also outscales most of the champions in the role, right? Like that obviously isn't a reasonable thing to have in the lane. And that was true not just of Smolder, but just of AD carries in general, particularly when we had that version of, Absorb Life, the much more powerful version of Absorb Life, and, the D-Blade at the time, et cetera, right? Some of the other systems I don't need to get into. Now, all of this having been said, I actually don't think it's crazy to like want Smolder mid. I played it a little. I thought it was pretty fun. There was something cool about that. And the answer here ultimately is I think we need a way to figure out how do we make it so that he doesn't have the same gameplay problems that he had before of being able to just win lane pretty easily or neutralize lane really effectively while also outscaling people. Like how do we give him a weakness that doesn't have splash damage on bot lane? And there are some examples of champions that have this paradigm, right? Kog'Maw, for example, has this where Kog'Maw's normal bot lane build is just AS on hit nonsense, right? Like you build a bunch of attack speed and you attack people. That's the thing that you do, right? Whereas in mid lane, he has a mage build that's AP. And part of why that build is reasonable there and why he doesn't have some of the same problems, even though he does scale really well, right? Like AP Kog'Maw is actually an incredibly hard scaling champion. When you hit level 16, you are really powerful. Part of the reason why that's not problematic is that his early laning phase is very weak, right? He basically does very little. He has very little ability to be proactive, very little ability to scrap or to interact in the laning phase, partially because he's building AP, which doesn't scale his auto attacks that effectively. Obviously, there's the current build, or actually, I don't know if this build's still around, but the build that some people were doing a little earlier in the season, like a few patches ago, I saw people were doing like the Dusk and Dawn build on Kog'Maw. That's a whole separate point. I'm not getting into that. I'm talking about like the older versions of Kog'Maw where bot lane was very cleanly just an on-hit build and mid lane was very cleanly an AP build. That's gotten mixed up a little bit more recently, which is okay. Anyway, I'm getting sidetracked here. But if Smolder had a different build in mid lane, which had the properties that we want, maybe that would be good. Maybe that build should be AP. Maybe it's supposed to be something else. Maybe it's supposed to be lethality Smolder is what he does when he goes mid, and when he goes bot, he builds crit, right? I don't know exactly what that looks like in terms of changing the scalings around, but we would need a way to differentiate them in a manner such that they have different properties on their gameplay to solve the kind of two issues that I identify here. One of which is, hey, Smolder from a gameplay perspective, the fact that he wants to hit these stack breakpoints, even though stacking is less powerful today on Smolder than it was before the changes that he received to make him more gold scaling, stacking is still really powerful, and hitting your stack thresholds earlier is a really strong thing to do. And he does still generally outscale most of the mid lane roster, even though he's not as powerful as a hypercarry as he once was. So we need a way to make it so that the fact that he has an easier time stacking in the solo lanes is not strictly beneficial over going bot lane, right? So there needs to be some weakness added there, or some like trade-off added there. And then secondarily, we need to make sure that he actually has reasonable like a reasonable game plan of, hey, I don't just beat people, I don't just out sustain these mages, but he has a functional laning pattern in some way, right? Like, what is that functional laning pattern when he's not just like exhausting the mage's mana pool and out trading them, and not just like bullying the melees? I'm not sure, right? I think both those problems are solvable, right? It could just be the actual answer is he needs a build that requires him to trade off really heavily in the early game, right? Like maybe like this is, hey, if, we add a mana ratio somewhere on the kit that's really rewarding in solo lanes for some reason, and now the mid lane Smolder build is Manamune Smolder, but it's not good to go that bot. You're just supposed to go Essence Reaver, you're supposed to go Crit or something like that. I don't know. Like, there's probably a way we can arrange the scalings on his kit to make this work. But I think that Fearless in and of itself is not sufficient to say, oh, suddenly let's have Smolder mid. Because if all we did was we reverted Smolder to the previous version where he was a better solo laner than he was in bot lane, we would encounter all those same problems most likely. Maybe given the changes to systems, maybe we wouldn't have the problems with him out sustaining through the laning phase, but we would certainly have the problems of, hey, he's now back to scaling exclusively with stacks. The solo lanes are where he gets stacks faster, and therefore he is heavily rewarded for going into those solo lanes, and those are going to be better most likely than bot lane. And then we'll have to tune around the solo lanes, and we won't be able to buff him bot lane, and we'll probably have to nerf bot lane in order to account for the solo lanes, right? And so those are the kind of problems I foresee. But I could also see the vision, right? I think Smolder mid is really cool. Like I said, I think, or actually, did I say this? I don't remember. I played it a little bit and I thought it was pretty fun. So Fearless in and of itself, not sufficient, as cool as Fearless is, but I definitely would love to see us take a stab at what Smolder mid would look like. And I'm not sure how we would solve those problems, but I think they're probably solvable. Could slowing champion dot tick rate be an effective way to balance some spell effects on them? And they were specifically asking about it being less than 1 second to make Rylai's not 100% uptime. Short answer to this question is I don't think this would be that effective. It would do something, but you have to consider that if we were doing this, I think we'd lose a lot of what makes a dot, right? Our dots in League are generally around 3 to 4 seconds in most cases, right? Like, obviously there are combinations of this where you get hit by brand passive and brand passive applies Leandry, so it's a total of 7 seconds, right? But brand passive itself is only 4 seconds, right? And most dots are 3 or 4 on champion kits. And the question is, okay, so let's suppose we have a 3 second dot and we lower the tick rate to 1.5 seconds. Most of our dots, many of them don't even tick when they are activated. And so this is a case where your dot is now dealing damage twice over a 3 second duration, maybe 3 times if it hits at the beginning, but not even going to feel like a part of the dot, right? That's probably going to feel like a part of the spell or effect that's applying it. And so beyond the fact that probably doesn't really feel that much like a dot, it's just like slightly chunkier, like delayed damage, right? It's going to feel more like Zed ultimate, but really terrible than it is going to feel like an actual damage over time effect. If we made the dot like 1.5 or 1.25 second tick rate, in order to make Rylai's worse, Rylai's is still going to be really high uptime, right? We're talking about like 80 or 67% uptime on Rylai's, and that still provides a lot of the value that Rylai's is giving these dot champions, which is I have a movement advantage on you near permanently, and that's not even considering the fact that, hey, Brand with Rylai's hits you. He hits you with the W. What if he just hits you with an E half a second later, and now you are going to be, experiencing the Rylai's slow for the first 2.5 seconds of this interaction, because you get applied a 1 second Rylai slow by the W, then you get hit by the E 0.5 seconds later. You get a 1 second slow there, which refreshes it. And then after that slow, the 1 second slow from the E is over, you get ticked by his passive dot and you get a 1 second slow again. So you're slowed for 2.5 seconds straight, and the outcome is actually not any different at all from live Rylai's, right? And so I think ultimately the thing that I think about in this space is that this is probably not an effective solution, both because the high percentage uptime on Rylai's, the gameplay is not that different. Number one, and because they're still going to permanently have a movement advantage on you in combat, right? Like even if momentarily you can move at your full movement speed, but also a lot of the times that's not even going to manifest because they'll hit you with another spell or whatever. And secondarily, the lower and lower we make dot tick rates, the less and less they're going to feel like dots, right? Especially because we don't really have the duration to play with on dots in League of Legends. League of Legends is a fairly fast-paced game combat-wise, and so like a dot that ticks every 2 or 3 seconds, which might work for some games where a dot might last 60 seconds or something like that, right? Say like RuneScape or something along those lines, where a dot ticking every 5 seconds is like, well, that's just part of a 2-minute dot or whatever, right? That's not really how League works. We don't have the durations in order to make that feel like a dot, because the durations on our dots are very generally low. And so I don't really think this would be effective or sensible. I do think there's, if we did believe for whatever reason that the synergy between Rylai's and dots was too high, there are lots of other solution spaces we could approach, to try and resolve this, right? Here are the two that immediately come to my mind. The first one, which I think is not a good solution, but is worth talking about, is we could give Rylai's a per target cooldown. We'd probably need to do some like messy, finicky stuff with this around, oh, it doesn't apply the cooldown if the target's already CC'd by something else or whatever, right? So that you don't like waste your your Rylai's slow on someone who's already CC'd or whatever, or maybe it like holds the slow until after the CC is over or something along those lines. This is really finicky, really rulesy. I don't like it. And like I think it's an interesting thought experiment, but I don't think it's actually a good solution. Kind of similar to this, where it's like, well, I guess technically it might mitigate a little bit, but it has so many problems in and of itself, and it's so complex that I don't think it's worth it. I guess this suggestion is not that complex. I just don't think it really works that well. The solution I actually would be thinking about, I think seriously, if we did decide that the interaction between Rylai's and dots was problematic and we wanted to make it slightly less powerful or meaningfully less powerful, is we could go back to the older version of Rylai's where we had different slow amounts for different types of spell tags. This is something I've been thinking about a lot recently because I am the person who made the Deathfire Touch that's on live right now, and I messed around a lot with different tagging based on spell tags, right? Like different durations based on spell tags. This is something I experimented with pretty heavily. I tried a version where the duration was always the same. I tried a version where we had different durations based on different spell tags. I tried versions where the numbers on the durations were different than the current versions that are on live, right? Which is, if you're not familiar with it, on live right now, it's 4 seconds for single target, 2 seconds for AoE, and then 1 second for pets and dots. Anyway, the spell tagging system, I think, has actually been really effective. This is something that we've been leveraging more and more over the past few years that I think has actually been really, really working for accomplishing a lot of the goals that we often want to get at without unintended consequences, right? We have basic ability haste on Shojin. We had the previous version of Shojin that had the immobilizing lever, which I actually think was really effective. I've tested some things internally around the like non-immobilizing spells lever, which I think actually works really well for avoiding some of the unintended dangerous consequences of reducing ability cooldowns and so on and so forth. Anyway, and so ultimately, I think that if we wanted to make Rylai's less powerful with dots, we would just say, okay, guess what, Rylai's? You now have a different slow magnitude or slow potency based on the type of spell the type of spell effect that's applying you. That would be easy to do. Now, there are a lot of reasons why we don't do this and why we moved away from this previously, because we did have a version of Rylai's that did this, right? Where it had a lower effect for dots. Part of the reason is that Rylai's is supposed to be powerful with damage over time, right? It's not supposed to be something that champions that have power, frequent applications of single target damage, are really, really, really powerful and can slow you really easily, right? Yeah, this is supposed to provide a movement advantage, and it's a high synergy item for dot champions, and that's supposed to be exciting for them. Now, is it the appropriate power level for those champions? I don't have a super strong opinion about that. I don't think it's actually overpowered on live or anything of that kind, and I don't think the shape is necessarily like terrible. But if we did decide that it was if that it was not something we wanted to support long term, I think the spell tagging system would be the first place we would look because it's a clean, effective solution without collateral damage. The downside is it will read really badly for people who look at the item and say, oh, I'm a dot champion, but this item says it's not good for me, right? Even if the actual end reality is that it's still good on dot champions if we reduce the slow by 5 to 10% for dots or whatever, and and maybe that means that we can like buff the stats on the item or make it cheaper or whatever, some combination of things like that. uh, People will still read that item and say this item is not for me because it's nerfed for me. This is one of the concerns I had with Deathfire Touch when I made this thing. One thing I did recognize though is not that many people actually read their keystone, especially not the reminder text. And a lot of people are just going to select the recommended runes and just feel good about that. And so I can make the Deathfire Touch, good on single target spells, so that it's good for some other champions, right? Like champions like say Vlad, or champions like say even Gangplank, which was a bit of a surprise to me, but not a like completely shocking one that it's good on him, right? He hasn't had a great keystone in a long time, and so something that has some synergy with him makes sense that that's good. And that allowed me to make Deathfire Touch good on some champions that it otherwise wouldn't have been good on, that I think it's actually good and healthy for. But that having been said, I think that uh, doing that same paradigm on an item does carry some risks around players reading the item and not believing that it's for them anymore. Because part of the item system, like one of the things that's actually important about the item system is not just that the item is factually good on your champion, but that it feels like it's good for your champion, that it feels fantasy enhancing for your champion. And if we made this change to Rylai's and the end result is, oh, it's factually good on brand still, but brand doesn't feel as good about buying it, then we've probably done a disservice to the item system by making that change, right? That's my kind of ultimate perspective here. But if we could make this change and then we open up Rylai's to be an interesting item for more champions, and brand still feels good about Rylai's, or insert your favorite Rylai's user, and still feels good about Rylai's, then yeah, sure, maybe that's fine, right? Maybe there's a good solution space there. But that would be my instinct is, if we did decide this was a problem, I think the first place we would be going is to spell tagging, not to slowing dot tick rate. Again, I think the main problems with that are like, it probably doesn't really feel like a dot afterwards if we slow the tick rate significantly, just due to the short durations of dots we have in the game generally. And also secondarily, that it probably isn't that effective because it still will be providing the same effective, like, I always have a movement advantage on you in combat, with fairly high uptime. And the uptime still will be 100% in a lot of cases because champions that have dots also do have other spells they can hit you with. And sometimes they will hit you with those spells during the window when the Rylai's would otherwise have dot, like downtime on their dot exactly, right? And so I don't think this exact suggestion has a ton of merit, but I do think that the space is interesting enough to talk about, though. Rod of Ages changes. Could it have ability haste? I normally don't put like smaller like item questions like this into the doc because I think that the answers to them tend to not be that interesting. But this one I put in because I think it's really interesting, because this is actually something that I really heavily considered during the season 14 item update, right? Something that I talk about a fair amount when I was working on those changes was I re-examined the stats that all of the different AP subclasses were getting from the item system, and whether they were getting the right amount of different stats, and whether they had the right level of access to different kinds of utility stats. And my conclusion, which I think holds up today, was that at the time there was too much health that you couldn't avoid in the AP system. There was too much generic haste in the AP system, and haste needed to be more of an intentional choice, and there should just be less health in general in the AP system. And I think all of those things hold up today, in that by exchanging those things for more AP in the AP system, the mage system now, like mages especially, make more sense in the system. And even the other, sort of unrelated, or I guess not unrelated, the other champions that share in the system, right, like AP assassins and AP fighters and such, have benefited, I think, a lot from the stat spread being closer to what it is today comparatively to the pre-season 14 version of the system, right, the mythic version of the AP system. But I did heavily consider having haste on Rod of Ages because I was having this. I remember this conversation. I don't remember who brought this up, but some designer I was talking with. I was having a conversation with a couple of designers, plus Phlox and Captain Gameplay. But I don't remember who brought this up, but someone was mentioning, hey, if you're buying health and mana and AP, you probably do want to cast a lot of spells, right? There are some counter examples, right? Like, TF, for example, doesn't care that much, as much about haste as other champions, and he does like to buy Rod of Ages. But most of the Roa users, right? You think of champions like Rise and Cassidon and stuff like champions like that are like, yeah, of course I'm buying Rod of Ages because I want to get into the fight. I need a lot of mana to cast my spells, and of course I want AP to deal more damage, and so haste makes a lot of sense in that space. Um, and I never actually tested it, but I did really spend a lot of time considering, like, oh, is Catalyst and therefore Rod of Ages supposed to have haste because of that? And my conclusion was no, at least not at that time. Partially because Lost Chapter has haste on it, and I didn't want to just jam a million haste into all of the starting items. Right? I think it's actually good that there are some items that don't have haste on them. This is one of the things I think we ran into. We ran into trouble with this in the Mythic system, where the solution to every problem of an item not being accessible enough was, oh, let's just slap some extra haste on it, right? And then that resulted in, well, every champion has a million haste in the mythic system, and therefore we end up like having to tune a lot of cooldowns around very 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 high haste values later in the game, and even earlier in the game, a lot of cooldowns were getting a lot lower than they probably should have been, without intentional choice to optimize around that cooldown, because there was just so much random haste on so many items, right? A lot of our mythics were guilty of this. So just like pretty much all the mythics except the 80 carry ones had haste on them, right? It's kind of a funny thing to say, but it is true in almost all cases. If you look back at the mythics that we had, they pretty much almost all had haste. And that was because it made them more generic, and that was a goal of the mythic system. We don't need to get into all of that here. But ultimately, I decided against doing this at the time because Lost Chapter had haste, and that meant that we needed to have haste on all of the Lost Chapter items. I do think, looking at the system now, I wonder if there's not a better version of the system where Lost Chapter actually doesn't have haste on it, and Ludens, for example, is the AP item, like the AP mana item that has no haste instead of Rod of Ages, and then Catalyst has some haste, and we arrange the system a little differently. One of the things that's interesting is the Ludens today has 10 haste on it, which is something I actually tested in the Season 14 item update, but I didn't ship it that way. That's actually a change that the live pod made. I think that was in 1419, although I'm not 100% sure. But I think that was a change the live pod made, which I was actually really happy about. I think it was something that I was a huge supporter of, because when I tried that internally, I got some immediate like negative feedback of, oh, I don't want my Ludens to have 10 haste on it, or I don't want my Ludens to have no haste on it. Give me my haste back. But I think that was anchoring to the previous system, and I think that actually a Ludens that just has a ton of AP and helps you burst people might actually feel really good and really appropriate for some of the burst mages that do like Ludens, like LeBlanc, for example. Now, it's possible there's too much of a feels loss having literally no haste on Ludens, but I think a world where Lost Chapter combines with haste items to give you things like Blackfire Torch and Archangel's Staff that should clearly have haste on them, and then Ludens is the no haste item, might actually be more appropriate, kind of in line with my thinking for the Season 14 item changes around don't give champions stats, or like don't force champions into stats that they don't necessarily want unless it's really doing something super positive for them. Maybe the actual answer here is that the haste is doing something really good for those burst champions, and that the feels of it would be too bad without any haste at all on the item. That's possible, right? We never tested literally zero haste. We only tested 10. But ultimately, my thought process on this is haste could make sense on Roa. I think that's something that could happen, but I don't necessarily want to like homogenize all of our starting items to say like, yeah, if you're an AP champion, you're buying a first item, you must have haste. I think it's actually good that there is an item option with no haste on it, and I also think it's good that there's an first item option for these champions that is very cheap, right? Like that's what Rod of Ages is doing, is it's serving as a very 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 fast cheap spike that then has some scaling properties, but allows you to spike a little bit earlier than the other items. It has a different build path. There's a lot of upside to these things existing, but I could definitely see versions of the AP system where Rod of Ages has haste, and there's some other options that cover the things that it's providing to the system literally right now. So definitely could see that being something that could be cool in the future in a different arrangement of the system. Anyway, this is going to be the end of the video for now. Thank you for watching number 21, and hopefully catch you next time.